Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. We have a technical paper to review, a new kind of ism, some interesting videos, and some pro-natalism news as well. So let's start with the paper. Fumitake Yoshizawa published a paper, The Wrong Inference to the Best Explanation for Antinatalism. In this paper, Yoshizawa criticizes Benatar's asymmetry and suggests that we should look at the alternative ways for antinatalism. Inference to best explanation is a type of reasoning. You look at some evidence or case which needs to be explained. Then you look at different possible explanations for this evidence or case. And then you select the best explanation from that set of possible explanations. This is inference to the best explanation, or in short, IBE. Let's look at an example. One fine day you come home to find that your house is empty. There could be many explanations for this. For the scope of this example, let's consider three. I did it, God did it, a burglar did it. And maybe based on some factors like, say, you don't remember yourselves emptying the house and you have never come across God doing such a thing, and maybe you see that the door lock is broken. There might even be some CCTV footage available. Based on all of this, you then infer that burglar did it is the best explanation. Now, there are many criticisms to this type of reasoning, like how do you know that you have not missed on a possible alternative explanation, or the criteria to decide best is somewhat loosely defined, and so on. But that is out of scope of this paper. Yoshizawa says Benatar is employing this type of reasoning for his antinatalist arguments. Consider the premises of Benatar's asymmetry. The first two are that presence of pain is bad and presence of pleasure is good. The third one is absence of pain is good even if that good is not enjoyed by anyone. And fourth is absence of pleasure is not bad unless somebody is deprived from that absence. About 3 and 4, Benatar says, in support of the asymmetry between 3 and 4, it can be shown that it has considerable explanatory power. It explains at least 4 other asymmetries that are quite plausible. What are those 4 asymmetries? Procreation asymmetry, distant suffering versus absent people, and prospective and retrospective beneficence. And they are explained by premises 3 and 4 according to Benatar. For now, let's just focus on one of those asymmetries, the procreative asymmetry, which says that we have a duty not to bring miserable lives into existence, but we don't have an equivalent duty to bring happy lives into existence. It's easy to see how Benatar's 3 and 4 explain this. We have a duty not to bring miserable lives into existence. That's because absence of pain of those miserable lives is good, even if they don't exist to enjoy that good. On the other hand, absence of pleasure of happy lives is not bad because they are not deprived of those absent pleasures. Benatar also provides alternative explanations and proves that the asymmetry between his premises 3 and 4 is the best explanation of them all. That's why Yoshizawa says Benatar is using inference to best explanation, or in short IBE. He then proceeds to claim how this IBE is typically used in practical ethics. This is a two-step process. In step 1, you start with an uncontroversial case, a case which is widely accepted to be true or valid, shown here in green, and then you choose best possible explanation, which is your IBE for this uncontroversial claim. This explanation is a general principle shown here in blue. In step 2, you apply that general principle to the controversial case that you want to evaluate, shown here in red. The green uncontroversial case is your premise here, and in red is your conclusion after applying general rule to the controversial case. Yoshizawa provides an example for this. Let's say I want to evaluate whether abortions are wrong. I start by taking an uncontroversial case that killing humans is wrong. The best explanation for why killing humans is wrong is that killing is wrong if it deprives beings of valuable future. That's step 1. And then in step 2, I apply that general principle to the controversial case of abortion. I can say that since abortion deprives fetuses of valuable future, abortion is wrong. So how is this employed by Benatar? Benatar takes procreation asymmetry as an uncontroversial case. That is his premise in this structure. He actually takes all 4 asymmetries, but for now we are only considering procreative asymmetry as a sample. We already saw that Benatar provides 3 and 4 as the best explanation for this premise. So 3 and 4 is the general principle here. He then applies this general principle to the controversial question of all procreative cases and concludes that all procreation is harmful to those who are brought into existence. Note that we have not reached the normative conclusion of whether it is immoral to bring beings into existence. We have only come to the evaluative point of harm caused to the beings by coming into existence. Yoshizawa recognizes this difference but says that it is not relevant. He says it remains true that when moral considerations are restricted solely to the interest of the person brought into existence, the axiological asymmetry directly leads to the antinatalist conclusion that procreation is always wrong in this real world. That's why here procreation is regarded as pro-tanto wrong, meaning that other considerations could outweigh its wrongness, like considerations of parents and so on. That implies that the evaluative conclusion that coming into existence is harmful can be replaced by the normative conclusion of procreation being wrong. So what's the problem with this? Yoshizawa says Benatar's application of this two-step IBE breaks two rules which are essential to the structure of two-step IBE. Let's have a look at those two rules. Recall the structure and example that Yoshizawa had started with. Rule 1 says that there should be no overlap between the premise and conclusion. The uncontroversial cases that are considered as premise and the cases which are controversial that we are trying to evaluate should be mutually exclusive. If these cases overlap, then they would be regarded as both uncontroversial and controversial, which is contradictory. In Yoshizawa's example about abortion, this rule is followed. The uncontroversial case involved adult humans and the abortion case was about fetuses. These two sets don't have any overlap. The second rule is about consistency, that there should be no conflict between the premise and conclusion. If the evaluative status of the cases in the premise and the conclusion conflict, then there is a structural flaw in the argument. This flaw could arise from the selection of cases, the identification of the principle, or the application of the principle. Yoshizawa claims that Benatar's IBE-based antinatalist argument breaks both these rules. The procreational asymmetry, which is considered in premise, says that some procreation is wrong, which is a subset of all procreative cases considered in the conclusion. Rule 2 is also broken because we have conflict between premise and conclusion. In premise, we had some procreation to be wrong, which means some other procreation was permissible. But in conclusion, we have all procreative cases to be wrong. Some versus all is the conflict here. Or in other words, procreation is permissible in some cases versus procreation is not permissible at all. This, according to Yoshizawa, proves Benatar is wrong. Therefore, he says that both critics and proponents should move away from Benatar's foundational but fundamentally flawed IBE argument and focus on exploring alternative approaches to antinatalism. So Yoshizawa is not against antinatalism in general. It is just the flaw in Benatar's arguments that he points out. The way to avoid breaking both rules is to start with cases which are uncontroversial and also non-procreative. This way, there is no overlap between the premise and conclusion. He provides three alternative approaches to antinatalism using the two-step IBE structure, which starts with non-procreative cases and still comes to antinatalist conclusions. First is the consent argument presented by Ashil Singh and Shauna Schifrin. As shown here, we start with uncontroversial cases where it is impermissible to do something to someone without their consent. These are non-consensual, non-procreative cases, like for example, sexual harassment or slavery. This is best explained by the general principle that it is impermissible to impose serious harm without their consent. And using that principle, we can say that since we cannot obtain consent of the being before they were brought into existence, and since all beings have to go through at least some harm in their life, it is impermissible to bring them into existence. We started with non-procreative cases and concluded on all procreative cases, so we avoided overlap between the two. So the consent-based argument avoids both the overlap of cases and seemingly the conflict between judgments about the cases in the premises and the conclusion. Second example Yoshizawa presents is from Benatar himself. It is from Benatar's paper Famine, Affluence and Procreation, Peter Singer and Antinatalism Light. Here we start with Peter Singer's drowning child experiment, that if we could save a child drowning in a shallow pond and if we could save it without paying an equivalent cost to us, then we should save that child. That's because if we can prevent bad without equivalent cost to us, then we should prevent that bad. And so if avoiding procreation is going to prevent extreme poverty, poverty, then we should avoid procreation. Third example is of risk argument. The principle that it is impermissible to impose a serious risk of harm onto someone can be supported by imposition of risks in everyday life non-procreative cases. Yoshizawa recognizes that Benatar has indeed used an analogy that uses non-procreative cases. Benatar compares two existing persons, one called sick and another called healthy. Sick gets sick but has capability of recovering from his sickness quickly. Healthy does not have this capability, but he never gets sick either. So absence of this capability to recover quickly is not a deprivation for healthy. But in every conceivable harm, a further defense of antinatalism, Benatar says that the analogy can be seen as simply an illumination or illustration of what has already been proved. Moreover, this analogy was used to show that presence of good is not really an advantage over its absence until it's a deprivation. So it is mainly between quadrant 4 and 2 and not between 3 and 4. So does this mean that Benatar's axiological asymmetry is now proven wrong, or is it just another attempt? There have been so many criticisms to Benatar's asymmetries that this reminds me of the book 100 Authors Against Einstein. I can't criticize or defend David Benatar, not because I don't have my own opinions, which I do, but because I'm not qualified to do it. But I can present some observations and ask a few questions to improve my understanding. So here are some questions and observations. First is the equivocation of evaluative conclusion that all cases of procreation are a harm to those who are brought into existence to the normative conclusion that all cases of procreation are morally wrong. If we don't equate that and keep only the evaluative part of the conclusion as is, does it resolve the conflict between the premise and conclusion, or would we be comparing between apples and oranges, as in comparing a duty to something being harmful? What about the overlap? In premise, we have a set of lives which we are permitted to bring into existence, and in conclusion is another set which is all lives that are harmed. This still seems like apples to oranges. However, the paper claims that a mapping could be constructed while going from procreational asymmetry to the general principle. A more charitable reading of Benatar's position is possible. First, he might assume a primitive correspondence principle between different categories of evaluations. For instance, he could argue that bad corresponds to a duty not to do, and not bad corresponds to no duty to do. Doing this, we can say that in case of procreational asymmetry, there are some lives for whom coming into existence is not bad. This is in direct conflict with the conclusion that coming into existence is bad for all lives. But there is a further question which rests on this mapping between bad and duty. This mapping is required because if the axiological asymmetry were inherently specified to moral duties to explain the procreation asymmetry, it would not be able to explain the other three asymmetries concerning reasons, attitudes, and emotions. Yoshizawa dedicates an entire section on why, on evaluative grounds, other three asymmetries also break both rules, which I don't understand how. Let's take an example of prospective beneficence, which says that it is strange to have a child to benefit that child, but it is not strange to not have a child to avoid harming that child. How is the part that it is strange to have a child to benefit that child in conflict with all lives are harmed by coming into existence? But Yoshizawa says that in all three instances, meaning all three asymmetries, the axiological asymmetry argument, when interpreted as an IB argument, encounters a conflicting overlap between the relevant premise and conclusion. Note the term conflicting overlap here. It means it violates both rules, Rule 1 and Rule 2. My next question is based on the interpretation of the four asymmetries. Let's take procreative asymmetry again. We have a duty not to bring miserable lives, but we don't have an equal duty to bring happy lives. The part that we don't have an equal duty to bring happy lives can be interpreted in two ways. One, it is permissible but not obligatory to bring happy lives. Or two, we are not taking any position on bringing happy lives. That is the position from neutrality. From a neutral point of view, we have no position on bringing non-miserable lives. In such a case, the conflicting overlap vanishes as these become disjoint sets, a set of miserable lives and a set of non-miserable lives. It just so happens that addition of these two sets corresponds to all lives. So the question is, can Yoshizawa still point out the flaw in this structure? Next is the application of step 2 to the antinatalist conclusion. We already saw why he equates evaluative to normative conclusion conclusion and the problems with this equivocation. But step 2 does not really lead even to evaluative claim that coming into existence is a harm. If you recall Benatar's chart of quadrants, Benatar compares quadrant 4 and 2 to show that coming into existence is not a real advantage over not coming into existence, whereas quadrant 3 and 1 are compared to show that non-existence has an advantage over coming into existence. So it does not look like Benatar takes a direct jump from the general principle which contains the asymmetry between points 3 and 4 and concludes that coming into existence is always a harm. Also, the explanatory power of asymmetry between 3 and 4 is beyond just these asymmetries. In chapter 6 of Better Never to Have Been, Benatar claims that my argument that coming into existence is always a harm solves the non-identity problem, avoids the repugnant conclusion in population ethics, avoids the mere addition problem in population ethics, and explains the asymmetry. Although that is the conclusion that does these things and not just the asymmetry. In a paper called Misconceived, Why These Further Criticisms of Antinatalism Fail, Benatar separates the explanatory power of the asymmetry to its inherent value. Mentioning Oliver Halich's two interpretations, he says, on the first view, the thesis stands independently of its explanatory power, even though its explanatory value provides further support for it. On the second view, the explanatory power constitutes the full grounds for accepting the asymmetry thesis. Professor Halich says that his second criticism is directed at a different view of my argument, according to which the explanatory power of asymmetry thesis constitutes the full grounds for accepting it. To clarify, I should say that this is not my view. I take the asymmetry thesis to be obvious, to me at least. I think that other people would do so too if they did not see its implication for procreation. I think what he means here is that axiological asymmetry follows if we remain consistent in our values that we already hold for the matters like procreation. That it explains other problems is an added benefit. Those were my observations. Well, not entirely my observations because I took a lot of help of Ola, who is a regular helper of our channel, Ivu from Portugal, and John W. from America, and Lawrence Anton, who organized a 2-hour discussion event for this paper and also did a lot of thinking and documenting about this topic. So thanks to all for helping me with this analysis. I came across yet another ism called Aponism. This comes from a Greek word aponia, meaning absence of pain. Aponism.org says Aponism is a moral philosophy rooted in the effort to abolish suffering wherever possible, an ideal of no pain that guides our choices at every level, from personal habits to collective governance. This vision is grounded in rational thought, empathy, and science rather than in supernatural or religious frameworks. There are 3 pillars of the movement: abolitionist veganism, anti-authoritarianism, and antinatalism. Within antinatalism, they have ethical concerns of consent and compassion, environmental responsibilities, and focus on already existing lives. They also have a 27-page manifesto on their website, which is free to download and goes into details of their thoughts, motivations, and foundations of each of the pillars. In another news, 2 antinatalist celebrities meet in Israel. Yes, Nimrod did an antinatalist outreach in a town called Haifa along with NihilAnand, Raphael, Samuel. Here we see David, Nimrod, and Raphael standing with antinatalist signs, and there is also a video on his channel Don't Procreate. NBC News, which has more than 11 million YouTube subscribers, reported in a video how Elon Musk has become the leading voice in pro-natalism movement. Not much of a news really, but what it says in the video is interesting. It reveals that Elon actually wants only smart people to have children. He is joined in his movement by other tech bros and also Vice President of the United States. LinkedIn is usually the place where we play it safe, but once in a while we do get someone calling spade a spade. Daniel Altman is a New York-based economist, and he posted about the gap in pro-natalist thinking about economy. He says that if Trump's tariff intentions come into reality, the demand for US-made goods would increase. This will increase the demand for workers, but the same people who want tariffs are also the ones who oppose immigration and want more babies. Yet the same folks who brought us high tariffs are against high levels of immigration. Instead, they are encouraging Americans to have more children. The only problem is, you guessed it, babies can't work in factories. It will be decades before a new generation of boomers can take high-skill manufacturing jobs. In the meantime, their parents will need more childcare, and so will the parents who decide to work more hours. We already have a shortage of affordable childcare now? If everyone's working in factories, who's going to take care of all the kids? It just doesn't add up. So, yeah, not an antinatalist post, but provide some arguments to talk against pronatalists in their own language. The Guardian had an article, "Having as many babies as possible is not the only way to show you love humanity," by Zoe Williams. It talks about conflicts within the factions of pronatalist movement. Musk's desire to populate Mars with his own seed doesn't neatly map onto RFK's anti-vax agenda, while Orban's pronatalism, that's Viktor Orban of Hungary, sounds like socially conservative gender operation. Yet pro-natalist forums tie themselves into knots trying to sound woke. But if this isn't ethno-nationalism, then why aren't the pro-natalists crying out for countries with low birth rates to receive refugees with open arms? Brother Marcus has re-uploaded a couple of his old study streams. In one, he looks at a paper by Elizabeth Harmon, Critical Study of Better Never to Have Been, The Harm of Coming into Existence by David Benatar, and David Benatar's paper, Still Better Never to Have Been, A Reply to More of My Critics. In another video, he looks at a paper called Is There a Case Against Being a Human Being by Patrick Hutchings. Lawrence posted a video where a person called Mani from Iran talks about an ancient book, Shahnameh, by Abul Kazam Firdausi, who was a 10th century Persian poet. The video talks about Firdausi's life, his book Shahnameh, pessimism contained within it, the proto-antinatalism in it, including many quotes and couplets, which Mani reads to us in English. There are some direct quotes lamenting the coming into existence within this unjust and unfair world, so this is very near to antinatalism. They also talk about Zurwanism, which was a fatalistic religion worshipping the god of time. This was an interesting video uncovering yet another aspect of antinatalism in ancient literature. So thanks to Lawrence and Mani for doing this. Masahiro Morioka's interview was published in an Italian magazine, Corriere della Sera. I translated the Italian version with the title The Philosopher and the Secret of Little Happiness That Saves from Pain. The interview is about many things, including Morioka's own journey, his views on religion, what he thinks of death and meaning of life, herbivorous masculinity, and also about his concept of painless civilization. But there is a reference to antinatalism where he says antinatalism has two pillars: the denial of birth, that is the idea that being born is fundamentally wrong, and the denial of procreation, that is the idea that we should not bring children into the world. I agree with the former and not necessarily with the latter. Exploring Antinatalism podcast had two new videos, both involving Mati Hairi. Jotsen Laulu is the name for a swan song, which is a famous Finnish song with a lot of symbolic and poetic references to pain, grief, and sorrow. Mati Hairi sang it on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast channel with its original Finnish lyrics. The second video was about a philosophical thought experiment about the conflict between freedom and happiness. It was constructed to demonstrate the contradictions that arise from trying to make people happy and free at the same time. This compares to God making a stone he himself can't lift. Interesting thought experiment, and I don't know if there'll be a sequel to this like it was in the case of Marzipan.